The American empire is coming to an end. Overseeing this descent at the highest levels of the federal and state governments is a motley collection of imbeciles, con artists, thieves, opportunists, and warmongering generals, and to be clear, I include the Democratic Party. Short of a sudden and widespread popular revolt, the death spiral appears unstoppable, meaning the United States as we know it will no longer exist in a decade, or at most, 2.
Christopher Hedges is the author of America, the Farewell Tour. You can find a link to it and to his other books on our website, cbc.ca/ideas, where you can always get our podcast.
We do not become autonomous and free human beings by building pathetic, tiny monuments to ourselves. It is through self-sacrifice and humility that we affirm the sanctity of others and the sanctity of ourselves. Those who fight against cultural malice, whether squatting in old warehouses or as the Occupy movement did in taking over a public space, resisting in Standing Rock, or refusing to be broken by our prison system, have discovered that life is measured by infinitesimal and often unacknowledged acts of solidarity and kindness. These acts of kindness, like the nearly invisible strands of a spider's web, spin outward to connect our atomized and alienated souls to others. This belief, held although we may never see empirical proof, is profoundly transformative. But know this, when these acts are carried out on behalf of the oppressed and the demonized, when compassion defines the core of our lives, when we understand that justice is a manifestation of love, we are marginalized and condemned by our sociopathic elites. Those who resist effectively in the years ahead may not be able to stem the economic decline, the mounting political dysfunction, the collapse of empire, and the ecological disasters. But they will draw from acts of kindness and the kindness of others, the strength and courage to endure. It will be from these relationships, ones formed the way all genuine relationships form, face to face, rather than electronically, that radical organizations will rise from the ashes to resist.
Predicting the disintegration of America has been something of an industry among the chattering classes for a while, and it's accelerated in the last couple of years. But after the Sandy Hook school massacre, in which 20 children were fatally shot, Hedges wrote an article in 2013 for the Walrus magazine, where I happened to be working at the time. That article was uncanny in the way it looked ahead at the America which was to come. In it, he quoted the late American philosopher Richard Rorty, who said, and I'm quoting here, that when America's breakdown begins, the gains made in the past 40 years by black and brown Americans and by homosexuals will be wiped out.
Jocular contempt for women will come back into fashion. All the resentment which badly educated Americans feel about having their manners dictated to them by college graduates will find an outlet.
That was in 2013, and those words now seem prophetic.
Well, he wrote it even before then.
Yeah. Were they?
Well, there are intellectuals in the United States who understood what was happening, but they were pushed so far to the margins that their voices were not heard. Sheldon Wolin, for example, who we lost a couple years ago, taught at Berkeley and Princeton, wrote Democracy Incorporated. And these figures who as Rorty did, of course, called out the folly of neoliberalism were silenced, in essence. That critique was just unpalatable across the mainstream. So I think the serious critics of culture, Neil Postman, they knew what was coming.
There have been other moments of deep division in crisis in America, the Civil War, the Great Depression, the Red Scare, Vietnam, on and on it goes. What makes this particular moment distinct and different?
We've trashed our economy. We've deindustrialized the country. We've allowed our economic system to be seized by global speculators. And that, coupled with the century-long assault against radical and progressive movements, beginning in World War I, but with the Red Scare after World War I and the Palmer raids. And we saw a reemergence of those movements and unions because unions, like, for instance, the old United Mine Workers Union didn't come back into existence until the 1930s when Roosevelt permitted it to come back into existence. So with the breakdown of capitalism, there was a resurgence, but we were still in an industrialized country. We still had factories. We still made things. And that's where you get this kind of golden period of capitalist democracy in the 1950s. But alongside that was a steady assault beginning with the 1948 Taft-Hartley Act, which makes it very difficult for unions to organize. You saw a chipping away of New Deal programs. Remember, Roosevelt, with the massive unemployment, said if the private sector is incapable of providing jobs, then the government has to provide jobs, providing 12 million jobs. Social Security. And Roosevelt says that his greatest achievement is that he saved democracy. So we lost the radical and progressive. And then after the war, in the name of anti-communism, they disemboweled liberal institutions themselves, ending with this parody of what it means to be a liberal Democrat in the Clinton administration. The Clinton administration, or the Democratic Party under Bill Clinton, essentially became the Republican Party. It took over the issue of law and order, which was really a kind of code for the institutional racism which African Americans continue to suffer from. It was Clinton who expanded the prison system from 700,000 to over 2 million in the 1994 Omnibus Crime Bill, deregulating the FCC. So now we have about 5 or 6 corporations that control what 90% of Americans listen to and watch. It was under Clinton that we destroyed our welfare program. And 70% of the original recipients of welfare were children. It's under Clinton that we destroyed Glass-Steagall, and you didn't have a banking crisis in Canada because Chrétien didn't allow it. Yeah. He didn't rip down the firewalls between commercial and investment banks. Clinton did, which is what precipitated both our and the global financial crisis in 2008. So it became like the late Roman Republic, where the institutions and the language and iconography of democracy existed, but internally had become so corrupted, in essence been seized by corporate power, as to render it a mirage. And that, of course, sowed the seeds for Trump.
There's this 1986 film by the Quebec director Denis Arcand, and it's simply called The Decline of the American Empire. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it saw modern society's fixation on self-indulgence as an indicator of its decline. You've been talking about governments and corporations, but in the book you also talk on the individual level, this focus on self-indulgence. How are self-indulgence and decline related?
Well, that's a very important point. Yes, it became a society consumed by hedonism and narcissism, and it celebrated the qualities of psychopaths. You see it on any reality television show, that ability to manipulate, use, lie to others for your own advancement, a lack of empathy or capacity for remorse, the idea that wealth creates its own value. It doesn't matter how you achieve it. The yearning for celebrity, self-presentation, which is what Facebook and social media is fundamentally about. It's about what Neil Gabler called life, the movie. And what happened is our political system, our political campaigns became forms of reality television itself. So you manufactured personalities. George W. Bush becomes somebody you'd want to have a beer with, for instance.
Yeah.
And you confuse how you are made to feel with knowledge. And Trump could play that game better. That's the first part. And the second part is that across the political spectrum, the American public realized that the elites had betrayed them. And Trump's caustic, vulgar insults, whether it was directed at George Bush or Hillary Clinton, were kind of cathartic to an extremely, I would say, legitimately angry, and in particular white working class population that had been lied to. And of course, the anger was even greater at the Democratic Party because figures like Clinton or Obama continued to speak in that feel your pain language of liberalism while serving corporate power. And of course, we saw that in 2008 with Obama's response, which was to bail out the banks and Goldman Sachs, the people who carried out the fraud, and turn his back on the victims.
And is that the moment that it hit home for you, that America was on the decline, or was it earlier than that you were seeing these signs?
No, much earlier. First of all, I spent 20 years overseas. So I was very rarely in this country for 2 decades. And the changes that had taken place within the country were much more dramatic and starker upon my return. What corporations have done to former industrial cities like Camden, New Jersey, which per capita is the poorest city in the United States, or the coal fields of southern West Virginia, where they have turned the Appalachian Mountains into a toxic wasteland because they won't stop. And I think that comes from being a reporter and not sitting around Manhattan. And because if you get out there and listen, it's grim. And I have to raise pornography. I mean, we are a deeply pornified society, which fits completely with heartless capitalism, where everybody and everything, including the natural world, becomes a commodity that you exploit until exhaustion or collapse.
I wonder, though, if there's a conceptual trap within the very idea of talking about America's decline at this moment, because the United States itself was founded on this contradiction, a free and democratic nation that was built on enslaving millions of Africans and on the genocide of indigenous people. You know, I think about the African-American poet Langston Hughes, who wrote, "America never was America to me." So is America actually in decline, or are these fault lines and these contradictions just much more visible and perilous now?
Well, it is in decline in terms of its economic and its political power. I mean, China has overtaken it as the major manufacturing center of the world. But I think much of the decay, and James Baldwin writes about this, comes from the refusal on the part of especially the white majority to face who they were and where they came from, to mythologize the national myth. That whole notion of regeneration through violence. I mean, we as Americans are a deeply violent culture in a way that Canadians are not. And we still believe in the idea that violence is a form of purification. We have failed to confront who we were and what we did. African Americans who have never been paid reparations, although they built the country. And that inability to see ourselves for who we are has created these monstrosities, and Trump is a kind of case study for it. America was founded, as you point out, on, the quote-unquote founding fathers. Read what they wrote about Native Americans. They just wanted them all wiped out. It was a white, slave-holding, male, aristocratic elite. Women were disenfranchised. Men without property were disenfranchised. Of course, African Americans, Native Americans. And it was a closed system. The senators, which did the real legislative work, were appointed. And so the entire battle for American democracy, which Howard Zinn writes about in The People's History of the United States, has been one by which many hundreds, probably thousands of Americans have lost their lives. We had the bloodiest labor wars in the industrialized world. Hundreds of American workers were murdered. So they've won. It's been quite effective. John Ralston Saul calls it the corporate coup d'etat in slow motion. I don't always credit him, but I do in Canada.
Well, in Canada. So, Chris, when for you then was America closest to the ideal that it had for itself? Was there a moment or a period?
Well, I would say the ideal that America had for itself was one that we had to destroy if we were going to have an open society and a democratic system. And that battle has won.
How do you mean?
Well, the people who envisioned, I mean, if you read the Federalist Papers, they were terrified of popular will. They were grounded in Locke, who built an entire judicial system on the primacy of property rights as opposed to individual rights. They were racist. And so in that sense, it was democracy for a few and autocracy for everyone else. So that has been a constant battle. Since the founding of the country, we have had moments on the eve of World War I where popular movements, the old Wobblies, the CIO, the Communist Party, who was an important force that erased from U.S. history, the progressive movement, on and on and on, And so it's been a kind of seesaw. It's been a kind of back and forth. And we are now at a point where we've been utterly disarmed. We don't even have the vocabulary to explain what's happening to us, which is one of the most egregious class wars waged in the industrialized world. We'd have to go back to the Louis of late France. No, really, to find social inequality at this level. It's the worst income inequality in the United States since the Gilded Age, and it's worse than the Gilded Age, and it's getting worse. There's nothing left. I mean, we just saw massive tax cuts, which will remove an estimated $1.5 trillion over 10 years from government revenue. It's insane. And what are these people doing with their cuts and their money? They're hoarding the money, or they're buying back their stock. That's how you get the inflated stock market, which isn't sustainable. Because the major managers and CEOs, their compensation packages are tied to the stock. So it becomes Marx's understanding of fictitious capital, money making money. And at the same time, after the 2008 crash, they were lent, who knows, 7 trillion, whatever the figure is, dollars, by the Fed at 0% interest. And we had central banks in Europe, because this is global, lending money at negative percentage rate. They'd pay you to take money. But the money has to be repaid. So since they're not building anything or producing anything, it's through debt peonage. And that's where you get $1.4 trillion in student loans, which even if you declare bankruptcy still have to be repaid. That's where you get massive credit card debt. A year later on your credit card is 28%. Our healthcare system, which even if you have insurance, you're bombarded with rising quote-unquote co-payments, costs that aren't covered, and it's the most expensive and least efficient healthcare system in the industrialized world. So they are extracting their pound of flesh through austerity programs, forcing municipalities, I write about this in the beginning of the book with Scranton, to sell off sewer systems, parking authorities, utilities to private corporations who then jack up the rates. And so that predatory nature, it has created, Carl Polanyi writes about this, it's a mafia economy and ultimately a mafia political system. I mean, Trump and the people around him it is just an unchecked kleptocracy, both personally for the Trump family, but for the billionaire class. We see it with the privatization of public education. Why? Because the Department of Education spends $63 billion a year, and the hedge fund managers want it.
Well, Chris, I want to offer a counter-argument to you. So Ideas spoke with Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker about his book, Enlightenment Now. And in it, he argues, counter to what you argue, that most things have actually gotten better for most people over the decades, not worse. He says that health, longevity, literacy, income, and so on have actually improved. And he takes to task a certain kind of intellectual who seems to be more committed to despair than to progress.
The Enlightenment has worked. Perhaps the greatest story seldom told. And because this triumph is so unsung, the underlying ideals of reason, science, and humanism are unappreciated as well. Far from being an insipid consensus, these ideals are treated by today's intellectuals with indifference, skepticism, and sometimes contempt. Given the tremendous progress we've made in the past quarter millennium, in the past 250 years, I don't think there's any reason to think that it will suddenly do a U-turn. There have been predictions like that for as long as the Enlightenment has been in existence. There's been a counter-Enlightenment, which includes a kind of fatalism, a kind of pessimism. Spengler wrote in the 19-teens and expected that the West would decline, and it didn't happen. The world has been coming to an end for a very long time indeed, if you were to go by the predictions of these rather morose intellectuals. It's not a guarantee that we will avert disaster. No one could make such a guarantee. But you have to take with a grain of salt the constant predictions that this generation is special, that the progress that we have seen is suddenly going to end.
Steven Pinker mentions, quote, morose intellectuals and their constant predictions of the end. What do you think? Does he have a point?
No. He sounds like he's reading from Candide. He should get out of Harvard a little more. Figures like Pinker are popular because they tell us what we want to hear. But every single climate change report that I read has a subtext, which is that it is accelerating at a rate far faster than anyone predicted. I traveled all over the country for this book, from industrial wasteland to industrial wasteland. And the book was in many ways modeled after Emile Durkheim's book on suicide, that when you have a society in decay, it produces familiar pathologies, suicide being one, opioid addiction, hate groups, gambling. And then having been a war correspondent, I just don't know. I just find Pinker's analysis to be completely unplugged from reality. The fact is, empires, civilizations die. That's something that Plato understood. They have natural life cycles. The American empire is coming to an end. The nation has lost the power and respect needed to induce allies in Europe, Latin America, Asia, and Africa to do its bidding. Add the mounting destruction caused by climate change, and you have a recipe for an emerging dystopia. The empire will limp along, steadily losing influence until the dollar is dropped as the world's reserve currency, plunging the United States into a crippling depression, and instantly forcing a massive contraction of its military machine. Many of the estimated 69 empires that have existed throughout history lacked competent leadership in their decline. They ceded power to monstrosities such as the Roman emperors Caligula and Nero, or imbecile narcissists like Trump. We're not immortal any more than any other empire. The difference this time is that when we go down, we'll bring the whole planet with us. Yeah. And I find figures like Pinker very dangerous because it is the perpetuation of the myth of human progress, the idea that progress is inevitable. You know, he mentioned the Enlightenment. Well, it was the Enlightenment that gave us the Jacobins and ultimately the fascists and the communists. The idea that you could create a perfect world, as Dr. Pangloss said, by eradicating certain elements of that world. That comes directly out of the Enlightenment. So there's always been a very dark side to the Enlightenment, the utopian belief that we could create the perfect society if certain segments of that society were wiped out.
You talk about Marx and quote Marx at length in the book. Is Marxism a kind of utopianism?
Completely. I am not a Marxist, but Marx's critique of capital is probably the most important critique of capital. And remember that it was heavily reported. He and Engels, of course, ran textile firms. He knew what he was talking about. And Marx used a lot of Engels' data. So if I was running a hedge fund on Wall Street, I'll only hire Marxists because they understand that capitalism is about the exploitation of labor, the maximization of profit, and reducing the cost of labor. That's what Marx got. So Marx's solution is not something that is as utopian as any other kind of fantastic belief. I mean, but the problem with Marx, and I graduated from Harvard Divinity School, so I kind of come out of Calvin, is that he doesn't grasp human nature. He's, once he gets into his solution, I'm not with him. But in terms of his study of capitalism, he understood. He understood the nature of capitalism, he understood how it worked, and he understood where it was going. Marx warned that capitalism had built within it the seeds of its own destruction. There would come a day when capitalism would exhaust its potential and collapse. Marx did not know when that day would come, but he also knew that capitalist expansion was not eternally sustainable. Unable to expand and generate profits at past levels, the capitalist system would begin to consume the structures that sustained it. It would prey upon, in the name of austerity, the working class and the poor, driving them ever deeper into debt and poverty, and diminishing the capacity of the state to serve the basic needs of ordinary citizens. It would, as it has, increasingly automate or relocate jobs, including both manufacturing and professional positions, to countries with cheap pools of labor. This would trigger an economic assault on not only the working class, but the middle class, the bulwark of a capitalist democracy, that would be disguised by massive personal debt as incomes declined or remained stagnant and borrowing soared. Politics would, in the late stages of capitalism, become subordinate to economics, leading to political parties hollowed out of any real political content and abjectly subservient to the dictates of corporations. But as Marx warned, there is a limit to an economy built on austerity and the scaffolding of debt. There comes a moment, Marx knew, when there would be no new markets available and no new pools of people who could take on more debt. Capitalist oligarchs, meanwhile, hoard huge sums of wealth, $7.6 trillion stashed in overseas tax havens, exacted as tribute from those they dominate in debt and impoverish. Capitalism would, in the end, Marx said, turn on the so-called free market, along with the values and traditions it claimed to defend. It would, in its final stages, pillage the systems and structures that made capitalism possible. It would resort, as it causes widespread suffering, to harsher forms of repression to maintain social control. It would attempt, in a frantic last stand, to extract profit by looting and pillaging state institutions, contradicting its stated nature.
Well, I want to dig into corporatism and capitalism a bit more. You write that capitalism would attempt, quote, in a frantic last stand to extract profit by looting and pillaging state institutions, contradicting its stated nature. What is capitalism's stated nature?
That the market determines behavior, that when capitalist entities are unable to generate profit and collapse, they should die. And of course, all of this was exposed as a lie after 2008. And of course, with the impoverishment of the American working class, it's difficult to expand markets. Then, as Marx understood, these entities cannibalize the structures that make a capitalist democracy possible. We spoke earlier about the education system. But this is just now writ large throughout all aspects of American government. 70% of U.S. intelligence is privatized. Corporations like Bose Allen Hamilton, which gets 99% of its revenue from the U.S. government. We have Eric Prince, the brother of Betsy DeVos, making a push to privatize the war in Afghanistan, which has not gone particularly well. In fact, of course, we're losing it. But that doesn't matter because you have the war industry is making a killing. It's not good for anyone in Afghanistan. It's not good for us. It's certainly not good for stability within the Middle East. But it is good for this narrow segment of the country, i.e. those corporations which profit from it, and war has always been a business. So capitalism, the nature of capitalism as it's described by the Chicago School and others, bears no resemblance to the reality of capitalism. The creation of monopolies so that you destroy competition, the constant consolidation of these mega corporations, which then not only fix prices and jack prices up, but we know from SEC investigations fix LIBOR rates. I mean, they fix everything. So it's not really capitalism. And then when they get in trouble, it's corporate socialism. They go running to the state and loot the U.S. Treasury.
Well, and you, in this book, you travel across America to communities and cities across the country. So where have you personally seen that frantic last stand and that pillaging taking place on that ground level?
Well, I write out of Anderson, Indiana. So Anderson, Indiana used to be one of the major manufacturing centers for GM. Clinton passes NAFTA. GM moves to Monterrey, Mexico. They leveled a lot of those giant plants. So there's just these massive weed-choked fields. 25,000 workers with good union jobs, $25, $30 an hour, sometimes more. Health benefits, a pension plan, a union, gone. And the city, like all deindustrialized pockets, is in freefall with all of the attendant problems that I write about in the book, including massive problems with opioid overdoses. And there, I drove through the streets and churches are for sale. I mean, everything's closing up. A whole section of the city doesn't even have a supermarket. It's this descent where everybody just eats processed food from a convenience store. And so I was with a lot of the old UAW workers, and they told me that Bernie Sanders had huge support. But once Sanders was denied the nomination, I would argue the Democratic establishment fixed it so he couldn't get it, they voted for Trump. They weren't going to vote for Clinton, not after what had been done to them. And Anderson, like Scranton, you can just tick off almost every city in America, especially between the coasts. And you drive through it, and it's potholed streets. Streetlights are burned out. Public libraries are closed. In Camden, the library is gutted, and there's a tree growing out of it. And this, of course, gets into the whole issue on the failure of the part of the elites to address the social inequality that is deforming and destroying the country and that created Trump. Russia had nothing to do with it, and neither did Comey or the Podesta emails. It had to do with a rapacious, greedy, myopic elite that embraced an ideology which was ridiculous from its start, neoliberalism, as David Harvey points out in his very good book, to enrich themselves and their class.
You're listening to Ideas on CBC Radio, SiriusXM, and cbc.ca/ideas, where you can always get our podcast. I'm Rachel Giza, sitting in for Paul Kennedy. Christopher Hedges is a columnist for the website Truthdig. He spent nearly 2 decades as a foreign correspondent, mostly with the New York Times, in Central America, the Middle East, Africa, and the Balkans. He was part of the team which won a Pulitzer Prize in 2002 for its coverage of global terrorism. And in the same year, he also received the Amnesty International Global Award for Human Rights Journalism. Chris Hedges has also written over a dozen books. In this episode, we're talking about his most recent one, America, the Farewell Tour, in which he argues that American society is in decline primarily because of systemic economic injustice, or what he calls casino capitalism.
Our casino capitalism has merged with the gambling industry. The entire system is parasitic. It is designed to prey on the desperate, young men and women burdened by student loans, underpaid workers burdened by credit card debt and mortgages, towns and cities forced to borrow to maintain municipal services. Casino magnates and hedge fund managers add nothing of value to society. They do not generate money. They redistribute it upward to the 1%.
Christopher Hedges also studied theology at Harvard Divinity School and is an ordained Presbyterian minister. His view of humanity is dark, as he readily admits, given his Calvinist worldview. And maybe it's that worldview that makes America, the Farewell Tour, read like a set of disturbing prophecies.
The most ominous danger we face comes from the marginalization and destruction of institutions, including the courts, academia, legislative bodies, cultural organizations, and the press, that once ensured that civil discourse was rooted in reality and fact, helped us distinguish lies from truth, and facilitated justice. Trump and today's Republican Party represent the last stage in the emergence of corporate totalitarianism. Pillage and oppression are justified by the permanent lie. The permanent lie is different from the falsehoods and half-truths uttered by politicians such as Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. The common political lie these politicians employed was not designed to cancel out reality. The permanent lie is not circumscribed by reality. It is perpetuated even in the face of overwhelming evidence that discredits it. It is irrational. Those who speak in the language of truth and fact are attacked as liars, traitors, and purveyors of fake news. They are banished from the public sphere once totalitarian elites accrue sufficient power, a power now granted to them with the revoking of net neutrality. The iron refusal by those who engage in the permanent lie to acknowledge reality, no matter how transparent reality becomes, creates a collective psychosis.
Chris, you write about something you call the permanent lie. What is that lie?
The permanent lie ignores reality completely. And this, of course, is the danger of the Trump administration, where reality doesn't matter. And it's endemic to all totalitarian societies, where you perpetually broadcast falsehoods. And it creates a kind of collective schizophrenia, because what you see around you doesn't have any relation to what you hear, and yet the message is so overpowering that you're kind of knocked off balance. You don't know what is true and what is false. And that is a characteristic of all totalitarian societies.
This so-called post-truth phenomenon where, as you're saying, the facts don't matter, we're bombarded with lies, memes like alternative facts and truth isn't truth are making the rounds. You call this irrational and ominous. How is this kind of irrationality ominous?
Well, because when you, as we have done, destroy institutions, that would be the press, the courts, academia, whose job is to keep civil and political discourse rooted in verifiable fact. Once facts are interchangeable with opinions, then it becomes an Alice in Wonderland kind of experience where nothing makes sense. I mean, what does Alice say at one point? Do cats eat mice, or do mice eat cats, or do cats eat mice? Well, it doesn't really matter. Well, that's Trump right there. And a society unmoored from verifiable fact is a society in deep distress. And it creates a kind of paralysis. Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. Voltaire. I found this in my book on the Christian right. You can't have a rational discourse with someone who believes that every living creature and the entire world was created in 6 days, and that the T-Rex was in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, who were real people, and they put a saddle on T-Rex and rode it around, which is in the diorama that's in the Creationist Museum in Peterborough, Kentucky. And you laugh at it on the outside, but I went through that museum with crowds of people who believe it. And then when a significant portion of your population retreats into this form of magical thinking, you're utterly unable to respond to reality itself in a rational or a meaningful way.
Well, and I'm curious about that because there is this intense loyalty by white evangelicals to Trump, who is not in any way a Christian-seeming person in how he conducts himself. It doesn't appear rational, the allegiance to Trump from a group of people who are at odds with everything that he embodies. So how much do you think that the rise of the religious right has contributed to this rise of irrationality and post-truth reality that we're living in?
Well, I mean, remember, they have their own universities, their own systems of indoctrination through Christian television and broadcasting. You know, the New York Times, when they run the bestseller list, they don't include quote-unquote Christian books because it would dominate every single one on the list. I would argue that they are completely in sync with Trump. I covered these people. These mega churches are run by pastors who are as sleazy and corrupt as Trump. They can't be questioned. They're in direct contact with God. That's the first part. The second part is I don't look at the Christian right as a religious movement. They're Christian heretics. They have used biblical language to sanctify the worst aspects of American capitalism, white supremacy, and imperialism. And fundamentally, they are groups that are about hate. They are biblically illiterate. I mean, as soon as they found out I graduated, my father was a minister, I graduated from Divinity School, and I spent 2 years with him. As soon as they found out I came out of a biblical tradition, they did not want to talk about the Bible with me because they're selective literalists. They have been handed certain passages that they use to justify an ideology. So 81% of quote-unquote evangelicals support Trump. Trump has no belief system of his own, no ideology, and so this ideology is filling the vacuum. But they're the same. They are people who externalize evil. They are absolutists who believe that they cannot be questioned. They are intolerant of anybody outside their cultish belief system. They ostensibly present themselves as a moral force. I mean, Sarah Sanders attempts to do this as she lies every single day to the press and the American public. But what they are is a species of the German Christian church, which was created by the Nazis. So you had the Christian cross on one side and the Nazi flag on the other. It's the fusion of the iconography and language of the state with the religion. And that's extremely dangerous. So they use the sacral language of the Bible to deify the worst aspects of the United States.
Well, and it's also a movement that is palpably angry, it seems to me. And I feel like the anger you see coming from the religious right, we're seeing its echoes and its counterparts around the world, whether it's Hindu nationalism in India or the Burmese carnage which has been inflicted on the Rohingya. And in fact, one of the thinkers that you mentioned in your book was featured on this program, Pankaj Mishra,
yeah, he's good,
who wrote The Age of Anger, A History of the Present.
Whenever you have an economic crisis, you have political dysfunction, you have opaque forces of the global economy working on you, you can't identify them, and you will again start channeling your rage against whoever is nearest to you, immigrants, Muslims, Mexicans, and also women. Women have become in recent years the target of a whole lot of masculine rage. And again, this is something we've seen before. This particular phenomena of, people being promised empowerment, people being promised the emancipations of the modern world, and then discovering that this process of liberation is much, much harder than they imagined, basically generates a lot of rage, which is then turned against weaker peoples, which is channeled into all kinds of compensatory fantasies of power, whether it's cultural nationalism or militant violence.
Why do militant violence and a mythologized, romanticized past so often get paired together?
Because you have an assault on identity. So I was walking through Montgomery, Alabama with Brian Stevenson, the great civil rights attorney who defends death row prisoners, most of whom, of course, are poor and black. And he's pointed out all the Confederate monuments in Montgomery, and half the city's black. And he said most of these were put up in the last 10 years. And I said, that reminds me of Yugoslavia, where you had the economic collapse of Yugoslavia, a sense of disempowerment, instability, a state that was unable to respond in a meaningful way to acute distress. And people created mythical narratives of the Serbs or the Croats or the Muslims to give themselves an identity and to sanctify their own hatred, which ultimately became a fratricide. I like Mishra a lot. I think he really understands it.
You're critical throughout America, the Farewell Tour, of progressives and identity politics. You write, and I'm quoting here, "The liberal church, like the bankrupt liberal class, holds up multiculturalism and identity politics as an ethical imperative and ignores the primacy of economic and social justice." Now, that term, identity politics, it gets used a lot, and I don't know that there's a consensus about what it means. So what does identity politics mean to you?
It means the promotion of a particular ethnicity, race, gender, and the belief that the elevation of someone who comes from that group is a form of empowerment. But of course, that's completely false. The corporate elites, and we begin going all the way back to the advertiser Bennington, Calvin Klein, who used to put up HIV positive models and stuff to be kind of risque. Obama was an example of this. You have just taken a page from colonialism where they push out a Mobutu to do their bidding. And what matters is the system that they're serving. So the idea that a woman president is somehow beneficial to an empire run amok is an absurdity. It redefines what feminism should be, which is about the empowerment of oppressed women. Probably 3/4 of African Americans are living in worse poverty and worse violence in terms of what's happening in these militarized marginal communities than when King marched on Selma. And so the elites have learned to diversify. I mean, Trudeau did it with his cabinet. But that just becomes a kind of feint, a cover, to maintain a system of institutional racism and corporate exploitation, which is steadily turning the lives of the poor and working men and women into hell. They are approaching conditions. They've already embraced conditions not seen in the industrialized world since the textile mills of Manchester at the end of the 19th century, They've already reached those conditions in places like China and Bangladesh, but those conditions are increasingly defining what it means to be a worker in the United States. And let's not forget that corporations in the United States, we have 25% of the world's prison population, 2.3 million people, or 5% of the world's population. Again, mass incarceration is a form of social control of poor black and brown bodies, discarded, left behind in these deindustrialized pockets where they can't create an income. They're not creating an income for corporations on the streets, but lock them in a cage and they can generate $50,000 or $60,000 a year for prison contractors, private phone companies, private medical services, private money transfer companies, private commissaries, on and on and on. But you are now seeing American corporations, including big ones, Hewlett-Packard, McDonald's, will make its uniforms in the prison system because the argument the prison authorities make is you don't have to pay 22 or 32 cents an hour in Bangladesh. You can pay that in an American prison. They can't organize. They can't complain about working conditions. They can't get paid for sick days. And if there's any kind of a problem, we throw them into solitary for a year. So that kind of return to unbridled, exploitive systems of capitalism, it's already cemented into place. I mean, this is what Apple does with its subcontractors in China, where people climb, they fail to make their quotas, constant wage theft, and they climb to the top of these buildings and throw themselves off, etc. But that is increasingly defining working conditions in the first world.
But isn't there a way in a critique about economic injustice to talk about how identities based on race and gender complicate and exacerbate the problem of social injustice? I hear your point about making a woman president or making a black man president doesn't stop racism or sexism, but isn't it true that many people are oppressed worse because of the identities that they have? That we know that black women earn less than white women.
But that's economic justice. I mean, that's my whole point. So you take the Occupy movement. The Occupy movement was largely a white middle class kids who got out of college. There was no place. Well, they weren't joined by people from marginal communities of color, because these kids suddenly discovered that they couldn't find meaningful employment. We're dealing with issues of evictions, police violence. When you went to these marginal communities, they've been dealing with this for decades. And the question they legitimately asked was, where were you? Well, you were involved in your boutique activism about multicultural. So obviously, I support diversity. I want the empowerment of these groups, but not divorced from economic justice.
So do you think a movement like Black Lives Matter ticks those boxes for you? Do you feel like a movement that is speaking specifically about the experiences of economic injustice, police brutality within African American communities and against African American people, is that movement problematic to you because of identity politics, or do you feel like it marries the question of economic justice to racial identity?
Well, they're certainly aware of that there's a reason they're in Ferguson or Baltimore. But we have a crisis in the United States of police terror. 3.3 citizens a day, almost all unarmed, are shot dead. And almost all of them are poor people of color. And they are responding to that crisis of police terror. And terror is the right word, having come out of those communities. If you are a mother with a teenage son and it's dark, you don't know if they're coming home. And I teach in a prison system, so I see it up close, the collapse of the judicial system. 94% of our prisoners never get a jury trial. They're forced to plea out, and the sentences are horrific, 3 or 4 times longer what they would be in any other country. So I think that those groups are important, but we're not going to successfully recreate a society whereby they have opportunity until we create an economic system where they can be integrated into that system. There are 3 forms of social control against the poor: mass incarceration, evictions, which is often ignored. So you lock up the men and you evict the women and children. And this gets into why I support reparations, why I support a guaranteed income, why I support the creation of government jobs. Until that's done, that problem, you can decry police violence all you want, but until these communities and families are resurrected and given a place in the society, those forms of social control are necessary by the corporate state to keep these people in check. Resistance entails suffering. It requires self-sacrifice. It accepts that we may be destroyed. It is not rational. It is not about the pursuit of happiness. It is about the pursuit of freedom. Resistance accepts that even if we fail, there is an inner freedom that comes with defiance. And perhaps this is the only freedom and true happiness we will ever know. To resist evil is the highest achievement of human life. It is the supreme act of love. It is to carry the cross, as the theologian James Cone reminds us, and to be acutely aware that what we are carrying is also what we will die upon.
You write so passionately about the ideal of resistance. Is resistance a spiritual act?
Yes.
How so?
It's an act of faith. Because empirically, everything you do in terms of resisting radical evil, as Kant called it, may show that all of your efforts have been futile. But it doesn't invalidate resistance. It's the belief, as Daniel Berrigan once told me, the great radical priest, that the good draws to it the good, even though there's nothing around us to justify that belief. The Buddhists call it karma. And I think that that's true. I think that having covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe, I saw how these great dissidents, I was in the Magic Lantern Theater in Prague every night with Václav Havel, that you keep that other moral narrative alive. And you don't always know who hears it, what effect it has, and it's only sustainable by faith. And I don't mean in kind of any orthodox religiosity. It's what Niebuhr calls sublime madness. The belief that, an act of resistance in itself confers freedom. And I think that's right, even if you fail. And it's bleak out there. But we can't use the word hope if we don't resist. I have children. These corporate forces have us by the throat, and they have my children by the throat. I don't know if we're even going to survive as a species. And we may fail. But, as parents, we have a duty to make sure that at least our children say they tried. And that will require forms of self-sacrifice. It will be unpleasant, maybe even dangerous. It means removing our faith in established systems of power, which have proven unable to deal with the most significant challenge to human life, which is climate change, which was first identified as a problem in 1902 or 1905. I mean, as the world devolves, people are going to look back at us and say, were we the good Germans? Did we just sit there and watch the trains roll by and do nothing? And I don't want them to say that about me.
Chris Hedges, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to talk with you.
Thank you.